Hi, everyone. My name is Omar Sikander. I'm a solutions engineer for SecurityGate, and welcome to the IEC 62443 Part 3-2 demo within the SecurityGate platform. I'd like to start off with just a few slides to level set on the approach that we took in developing this workflow. The first statement that I'd like to make is that we incorporated the standards language that was published by the ISA Secure Steering Committee that developed this standard and incorporated it into a workflow that was easy to follow, easy to get started with, and streamlined to help anyone, whether you're a seasoned veteran of the OT space or if you're just starting out and relatively unfamiliar with the standard, ultimately helping you jump right in into conducting a full-fledged 62443 Part 3-2 risk assessment. Now, tabbing over to the platform itself, the idea behind 62443 is to ultimately be able to tell a story around a particular scenario or threat and qualitatively and quantitatively assign or understand the impact of that threat if it does manifest and what the probability is of that threat manifesting based off of current countermeasures or potentially added countermeasures with the risk assessment. And how we conduct this risk assessment, we really start with the first step, which is defining that risk matrix that you saw earlier. We have a full-fledged user interface to help replicate a risk matrix that might be provided or that might be available within the organization. We can go up to a 6x6 risk matrix, and you can define the axes to replicate, again, what is shown within the risk matrix that is relevant. The next step is to define the likelihood, and you can do this by simply using this user interface and going with guide words or nomenclature that is relevant within your organization and provide a qualitative description of the likelihood, as well as maybe change or add or modify the quantitative guidance for that particular likelihood as well. Once you're done with the likelihood, you can move on to the other axis, which is the severity. And in a similar fashion, you can qualitatively use guide words as well as define the scale for the severity. And the third step is to define the categories. You can have up to as many categories as you have severities within the platform. So in this example, I've chosen categories that I've run across recently, such as health and safety, financial, environmental, reputational, and brand and legal compliance. You don't have to have all five. If you want to focus on one, you can remove or only focus on the one that's relevant for this particular risk assessment. And once you've got that all completed, you can submit the risk matrix and move on to identifying the color codes. So adding color to the risk matrix is as simple as clicking down. And of course, I'm selecting arbitrary colors here for the purposes of the demonstration. And I'm doing that because once you've selected these colors for the risk matrix, you'll be able to preview and then make changes to the risk matrix to align it essentially with what you've been able to come up with or what's been available or presented to you within the organization. So as I finish here, my button that says risk matrix preview should become available here in a second. 2 more clicks and done. Now I can preview the risk matrix. It's definitely not going to be perfect, right? But for those visual operators like me, you can start aligning this risk matrix to ultimately get it to be what you're looking for. And you'll end up with something that looks like this in the end. Oops, wrong button. Something that looks like this. Once we've got the risk matrix identified, the next step is to actually schedule the assessment. There's some data that's important within the platform to be able to associate the scope of the assessment. So what site or facility you might be assessing, or system even, assigning the assessment a name so you can reference it in the future, identifying who will ultimately be responding to the assessment, providing a due date, and then of course selecting the risk matrix. And if I attempted to hit the OK button, receive an alert, because given the 62443 approach, the standard dictates that you've got to at least identify a system under consideration and either a zone or conduit or multiple zones or conduits. So the first thing I'll do is identify a system under consideration from the perspective of a heavy industries client, maybe an oil and gas asset owner. We can think of some of these systems that might exist within the core competency or the core workflows of the operations. So if I wanted to, for example, select a fluid storage system as the system that I'll be assessing, and within that system identifying the relevant zones, right? So for example, if I have segmented my zones into sensors and IO as one zone, PLCs and drives into another zone, and HMIs and engineering workstations into a third zone, I could select one or even multiple, or in this case, like these three as the zones that I'll be considering within my assessment. And once I've selected my systems under consideration, my zones, et cetera, I can actually go ahead and move on to starting the actual assessment. And you'll see that at the top, we've got a sequence of buttons, some of them that are grayed out. This is just to indicate the different steps that are part of the entire workflow. And you'll see that we have the first step available for us, as well as the last step, which is really for reference. In the initial step, as per the standard, typically before you go through the trouble of conducting a detailed risk assessment, there's some sort of decision criteria or decision point that's substantiated by conducting either a process hazard analysis, a layers of protection analysis, or a business impact analysis that ultimately determines that, yes, in fact, the circumstances are appropriate for a detailed risk assessment to be conducted against the system under consideration, as well as the zones within. Within the platform, you can simply add the decision criteria for reference using a rich text editor, as you see here, as well as if you've got a document, typically an Excel file that helped you conduct your PHA or your BIA, you could upload it here again for reference. And before I move on to the next, I'll suggest that there are additional buttons to help provide guidance in addition to what you see on the screen as an introduction. At any time, as we move through these steps within the workflow, we can access the additional buttons such as definitions, right? So if you didn't know specifically what a zone or a conduit or a PHA was, you could reference that button, as well as these ZCR requirements have direct language from the 62443 standard that's available thanks to a contractual relationship that SecurityGate enjoys with the organization that publishes these standards and maintains the licensing. So enough of that. I'll hit next step, and here we go to where it really begins, which is identifying what threat or scenario we're going to be assessing against. You'll see that I have an additional button available here, which is a threat catalog. So if you didn't have a particular threat that was assigned to you or provided to you, you can use this catalog to come up with some common threats that SecurityGate has seen in industry, as well as maybe some threats or threat that is common within industry, such as what's available from MITRE, if you're familiar with MITRE. So that's a threat catalog. And ultimately, what I got to do is populate this table. So I'll do that by hitting the Add Threat button. You'll see some of those threats that were displayed in that threat catalog populate, and you'll see that they're identified as either default, which means that SecurityGate developed these and incorporated into the platform, or some that are user defined, right? There is a reason for you to define your own threat as well as your own threat description. You can do that, and you'll see that I've got some that have been user defined. I know that there's two approaches I've seen within industry. One is to potentially get intricate, right, with these threats. I know that at the board level, ransomware is a threat that is on the mind of a lot of leaders, right, within different organizations. So if you wanted to create that threat and assess against it, you could. And another approach is in an effort to drive consistency and be able to compare data over time. We do have some clients that have used this platform and have shared that they only assess against a small number of threats, again, in order to drive consistency. And from a technological perspective, one client has shared that they only assess against two, just because from their perspective, this technology can only ultimately be compromised or lost, right? And regardless of what the threat could be on the front end, ultimately, these are the two manners in which that technology could be affected. So they just assess against that and have some additional descriptors on the back end. So I'll select those two threats, and you'll see that my table now begins to populate. I can select which zones and or conduits are relevant for each threat. So in the example that we're assessing against compromise of function, that's probably relevant for the zone 2 with PLCs and drives, and zone 3 with HMIs and engineering workstations, because maybe there's actual, some sort of interface to other devices such as PC or other ultimately used for development or for setup, but probably not relevant, right? Or maybe not relevant for the sensors and the IO that's out in the field. So if you didn't want to select that, you could avoid it. And then maybe for loss function, that could potentially affect all three, because you could lose, IO or sensor functionality if something was, completely taken down. I could access the standards language, help me understand how to fill up the remaining boxes, right? Which is a requirement as per the standard. So defining who the threat is, right, or what the threat source is. Is this a internal disgruntled employee, or is this a nation state with plenty of resources and intent to bring a system from desirable conditions to non-desirable conditions, right? So that's the idea, is really understanding the capability, the threat vectors, which really just means how they got into the zone or the conduit, the vulnerabilities associated, and the potentially affected assets. And at any time, you can again reference the standards language to help you information out. And once you've filled out those boxes, you could be able to continue. And here is where we can start conducting the iterative detailed risk assessment process. And we'll start with the unmitigated risk. My interpretation of unmitigated risk is just your starting point based off of what countermeasures are currently applied within the environment. What is your landscape, right? And what is your risk? But before we get to that, you've got to define what your goal is or what your objective is. So here's where the risk matrix starts coming into play. So some customers asset owners might want to assess against a risk rank as per the 62443 standard. There's 4 ranks that are defined: SL1, SL2, SL3, and SL4. And as you go higher in the list, the idea is that you might be preparing yourself against threat actors with increasing motivation, increasing expertise, increasing resources, right? So the amount of countermeasures to mitigate ultimately the risk would increase. The other approach is not necessarily tied to the standard, but is an approach that we have seen in industry, which is to assess against a particular risk rating. So if we table the SL1 through 4 and just talk about a location on this risk matrix, a particular asset owner might decide that for a very critical system like process safety system, nothing but highly unlikely and low impact is acceptable, right? So that might be the dark green area, and anything else would need to be mitigated out. So in this example, right, if we considered, risk assessing to risk rank, and we maybe believed that anything that is more risk, right, and the yellow area, right, or anything that's outside of green or yellow would require, an immense level of sign-off or would need to be mitigated out. That's what we'll use as the example-based case, right? So let's just set risk rank, And here we're going to tell platform logic that it's going to need to ultimately be able to identify when you need to make some sort of adjustment. So I'll select this here. I'll provide the logic that I want the platform to follow. And this is what would take probably the most time and the most deliberation. This is where consultants in collaboration with the asset owner or the asset owner's domain experts would start defining the landscape in accordance to the existing countermeasures. So I'm just going to pick some um, arbitrary items here from the drop downs themselves to show you the iterative process of the risk assessment. So this we can identify as our starting point. And once I finish there, I could hit the next step. And you'll see the platform will indicate the residual risk, right, or the most risk that we have, and ask for a decision to be made to either accept the risk because it's just part of doing business and there's no intent to ever remediate or mitigate this, or maybe we transfer the risk because there's cyber insurance and it's somebody else's problem, or we mitigate, right, by adding additional countermeasures and lowering or improving that residual risk in that landscape. Or we defer in the case of maybe we want to improve, but we don't have the right resources or timing is inadequate for us to be able to do this now, but we want to get back to it. So for the purposes of this demo, I'll accept and transfer one, and then I'll be able to mitigate another, and then hit the next step. So you'll see a very similar as the unmitigated risk, right? And again, I'll just briefly mention that we can reference the standard language to help figure out what we're doing in any particular step. And now we're being asked to add countermeasures to ultimately change our landscape. So if we wanted to make an improvement, maybe we would consider adding a firewall, right? Maybe this particular zone or these zones don't have firewalls in between. And that would maybe take the likelihood and drop it down to possible versus likely. And it would maybe influence these severity categories. Of course, again, I'm doing this arbitrarily just to provide an example. And we would go through this process and it would change our landscape, right? If I hit the wrong button there. Again, we would be asked to make a decision. So I choose to mitigate again because of residual risk. And the idea then we could add additional countermeasures, right? So if we're still not accepting of the particular risk as per the logic and as per the intent of the organization, maybe we add a threat detection solution as well as MFA, if I could spell correctly, but you get the idea. And then that would change my landscape, maybe drop it down to unlikely from a likelihood perspective, and have less of an impact across my severity categories. And then I could hit next step, right? And this is very iterative. So to move forward within the process, I'll go back to the beginning. And ultimately, the story that you can tell is, hey, we conducted a 6443 assessment. When we got to the facility and we made our observations of the countermeasures, we found that this was a threat landscape across these severity categories that were relevant to the organization. There's residual risk within health and safety, and there's residual risk within environmental. And in order to mitigate, these risks and get them to a tolerable level, we added a specific countermeasure. In this case, maybe it was a physical badge-in gate, right? And it changed our landscape and improved it, but we still weren't satisfied as per the target that we went to get to, which I think I as this E1. So we maybe added one or additional countermeasures or are considering adding that, which would ultimately change the landscape from an impact and likelihood perspective to where the organization is now comfortable. And that, in a nutshell, is the 62443 Part 3-2 approach that the SecurityGate platform takes. And I hope you enjoyed it. If this is of interest to you, please feel free to reach out to us. We'd love to talk more about your situation and how SecurityGate can help. Thanks and have a good one.